Hey everyone, my name is Francisco. This is Latin Entertainment, and welcome to Conversamos. Today's episode is on the Brazilian diaspora. From food, culture, socioeconomic issues, what does it mean to be Brazilian, and what is proximity to Latinidad? We hope you enjoy this episode of Conversamos.
Yeah, yo, is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. Music's helping me transform. I run the reservoir, the predator.
In your list of identities, how do you identify with Latinidad or Latin America, if you so? And that's kind of the big question for this whole discussion is like the relationship between you as Brazilian into the Latin America or Latinidad as well.
Sorry. Yeah, I can go first. I think it's kind of like peculiar that Brazilians often don't consider themselves as Latin Americans, right? I think when you say Latin, most of the times we go like, oh no, I'm not Latino, right? Or I'm Brazilian. So I think this is something that it's not, I think there's a lot of things actually that has to do with it. I would say the language is one of them. But I identify myself as a Latin American, and with Latinidad, yes.
And why do you?
Because I am in the continent, right? We are in the continent, and we are part of the culture, and I think it's the only thing that will probably maybe defer us is the language from the other countries in Latin America.
Technically, if I'm not wrong, Portuguese is a Lusiatic language. It's not like it falls under the umbrella, but you could say like Os Lusíadas, which is a very famous kind of a Odyssey-esque story poem, is where that word derives. And so linguistically, like I think it is frustrating when Portuguese and Spanish are so put as like it's the same thing, and people are like, "Oh, it's the same. Don't worry about it. Like you'll understand Spanish." And like, it's not that simple. I think that can be at times dismissive. I think you can lose nuance, which I think nuance is where we really need. It's a space we really need to get more comfortable in. Like, are Brazilians Latinidad? I think the answer might be maybe. I think it might depend on their specific context, on their family. But I don't want to say that in a way that seems like I don't want to be a part of it, because I really do want to be a part of the Latinidad community. But I also have like recently found out that I have a potentially Spanish biological father. So maybe that's different than other folks and other situations. But the linguistic element is like heart language is key, and Spanish and Portuguese are different, and that's okay.
So when you participate into international clubs and stuff, you usually get more. We get along with people from South America. When you have the culture is closer. So, and the language was really something that will be. It's different. You will be with everybody. I had friends from Argentina, from Venezuela, Colombia, but the way they bond was completely different than I was bonding because of the language too. So yeah, I would say linguistic is something.
For Augustine, would you mind just sharing your family's immigrant story or your immigrant story of how you came to the States in one part, but also now to Canada?
Yeah, you mentioned immigrating to like Canada and all of that. For me, it was a really loophole-esque process. I'm adopted by Canadians and Americans, and so I had access and privilege to a lot of things, but specifically being able to be a tri-citizen is one of those privileges, that I sometimes have difficulties with. But yeah, my parents did some interesting work in Brazil, and I grew up there. And it's an interesting challenge being integrated with a very white family, and also, you know, being kind of like half white myself, living here and knowing American culture from the bat, knowing Canadian culture because of trips. So I've had a very different experience than a lot of Brazilians who study in the US.
So yeah, my dad's family is Japanese. They came straight from, my grandparents came from Japan to Brazil, and my mother's family was from Brazil with Italian backgrounds. I started physical education here in Brazil. I went for 3 years here in the local college, and then my uncle and my aunt were working in the States, so they saw an opportunity for my sister and I to go there. So my sister finished high school, and I finished college as a physical education teacher. So I did spend 2.5 years in Indiana, and then I spent 2 months in Boston when we came back to Brazil.
And as you both are navigating the non-Brazilian spaces, and have you been, and where you may actually be speaking Brazilian, has anyone like confused when you're speaking Brazilian, Portuguese rather, with another language?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of times when we were speaking, because when I lived in the States, I had my sister with me, and we would go out to places, and then, you know, eventually it would speak Portuguese, and people were like, "Oh, you speak Spanish?" Yes, definitely a lot.
Nice.
Probably happens to me a little less, but yeah, definitely. I have gotten a lot of different, like, sometimes people will think I'm Greek or just like different stuff like that, because of the context usually. But yeah, it's interesting. People's ear for languages isn't always quite there.
And within the Brazilian community, is there specific dialects that you may be like, oh, you're from the southern region, northern, middle, or even for like speaking to a Portuguese person, you're like, oh, this is like Portuguese Brazilian, and or like however it may be.
Yeah, you can tell. You can definitely tell when a person is from the south, from Rio, from São Paulo, from the north. Like it's very easy to tell. And of course, if it's a Portuguese from Portugal too, it's very clear, the accent.
The region that I'm from, like everybody in Brazil clowns on that region, Goiás. I mean, I'm not from there, but I grew up there, and it's kind of like, I would say, I don't know, Flavia, like, would you say it's kind of like Goiás has the reputation of being like the Texas of Brazil? Kind of that vibe.
I would say so. we are the non very chatty. We're not very social here in Curitiba. We're the grumpy ones, actually.
Oh my God. Oh, great.
That's great. Thank you. And so for our next question now, how are Brazilians represented in Latin American media, and how is Brazilians represented in U.S. Latino media?
I don't know if we are very, I don't feel like Brazil is very well represented in the whole Latin America. I would say so. I think sometimes it's treated like two different continents, like Latin America and Brazil. This is the feeling I have, like, especially when you have like, I just feel like that. And in the media, right, in the showbiz, Brazilians, Latin America.
Yeah, I can speak more to like English media, or media that's made in English, or American media. I think it's at times so frustrating the way Brazil is portrayed as like this like very sexy, like one-dimensional place that's like either jungle or beach, and or, you know, it's like you don't see a whole lot of nuance. You don't see a whole lot of the complex identities that Brazilians have. Brazil's such an interesting overlap of different ethnic groups and races and languages. Brazil has the most uncontacted people groups of any country in the world. as of 2007. That was kind of the when the research was being done. That's what we found. There's so much richness to Brazilian culture, to Brazilian geography, and you almost never see that portrayed in films, which is why, like, when people find out I'm Brazilian, I almost don't lead with that, because people are like, oh, like, the girls in Brazil are so hot, or like, oh, like, Carnival, like, that's, like, you know, you're only seeing one side of, or one level, really, of Brazilian culture, and that can be hard.
Flavia, would you like to? Is there anything you can add to that?
Yeah, the stereotypes, right? I when I went to the United States, it was 2001, and really, there were people that would ask me, like, "Is it true that in Brazil, like, do you have like monkeys and snakes on the street, like all over the place?" I was like, so the stereotypes, right? The misinformation about the whole world, right? This is something, yeah. And of course the carnival and caipirinhas, carnaval, beaches, and you know, lots of hot women. It's a huge stereotype. Unfortunate, because we have so many other things here in Brazil.
And so maybe to flip this question now, how Latin America is represented in Brazilian media, and how are Latinas, as well as Latinas in the U.S. represented, if they are even represented?
I think there is a lot of there are different ways, the sides of it, right? I think Latins are
also go by nationalities, like how Bolivians represented, how Uruguayans, Argentinians, if that makes the question much more specific.
I think Argentinians, there's like a huge battle regarding sport, and in, you know, that everything here is better than Argentina. I work for a school that even in the school with students, the kids have this kind of rivalry, right? And there's a lot of sports rivalry in Brazil and Argentina. I would say, I think Brazil, it's very open. I think we are very open. We're very warm, and I think we're very welcoming of any nationality, right? I would say so, and we're interested about other cultures as well.
Thank you, Sharon. Yes, and Augustine.
Yeah, I definitely didn't. I mean, I didn't consume a ton of Brazilian media, so I want to say that, like, off the bat. Growing up, I just didn't watch a whole lot of TV, but I remember, yeah, there are multiple sides of it. I do remember, like, this kind of understanding as a kid based off of the things I would see on TV, that, like, Brazilians aren't Mexicans. Like, we're not. There's something about us that's, like, we want to, like, the kind of sibling, when it's frustrating when someone confuses you for someone who's similar to you or looks like you or to them seems like you. This kind of identity crisis where you're like, well, I'm not this and I'm not this, and so I'm going to put these things down and elevate myself. And I kind of felt that sense of, like, especially more, like, I grew up feeling more solidarity perhaps with South American Latinidad folks than Central, because, for one, like, the geography, like, literally the land is farther away, but also I think what I understood was, like, Central America is, you know, it's messy, there's too much going on there, there's blah, 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 like, and really these characters of Central America influenced a lot of the media that I was watching. But at the same time, we loved certain things, like Chavez is Mexican, right? Like, the comedy, a lot of our telenovelas made in Mexico, you know? And there's, like, simultaneously this sense of, like, wanting to be distinct but also wanting to take from that. And I think there's a healthier or like a better balance that we can find in the way we portray each other and care for each other. I love what you said about Brazilians being open. I think that's really true.
So let's add to that with our next question. So, what is the relationship between indigenous people of Brazil and Brazilians?
I would say there's not a lot of relationship. I think the indigenous people in Brazil are very left out. Very left out. There is an indigenous tribe here close to Paraná in Santa Catarina that I visit 3 times already. The second time that we've been there, we went as a school visit, and it was like March, and the kids were supposed to be in school. The indigenous kids were supposed to be in school, and they were not because they didn't have transportation because the government cut out funds for them. So they're there, and they are very left out of the society, but they're part of it. They're the ones who are here, right? So it's sad that there's not a good relationship, unfortunately.
Indigenous folks who live in what we would consider Brazil's borders are very, very vulnerable. I would want to, include also like Afro-Brazilians and Brazilians who are like darker skinned and like I don't want to forget like trans Brazilians, LGBTQ Brazilians. There's a lot of folks who are being left out of, especially now with the current policies and politicians who we see in power. The FUNAI, which is like the foundation that does like a lot of indigenous rights. They were briefly, I believe, the chairman or something, a pretty important position. Apologies for not knowing who, was a former member of a missions organization appointed by Jair, which is extremely inappropriate. Like that's a real conflict of interest, and we see. I would say the relationship is often very like take. Like, how can we trick the indigenous people? How can we take as much advantage of the resources, of the knowledge, of the culture? How can we use indigenous, like the cool things that we think, or the things that we think are cool from their culture? How can we use that for tourism reasons or whatever? Even anthropologists in the past, especially, we find like I've heard accounts of them like just treating indigenous people like zoo animals, and that it breaks my heart. It's so wrong. But yeah, I think it's a contentious relationship, and there is a lot of neglect. Like you were saying, like there's not much of a relationship, but especially in like Amazonas. Sorry, trying to hurry up. But in Amazonas, you see more outright violence, and we have a lot of activists who are facing threats daily. So
yeah, unfortunately, that is true. And of course, it's not everywhere true. Like there's a lot of people that we know that are very, that we know that respect, but there's a lot of places that still they struggle with that. I know if we're gonna move it to the queer. There's I don't know if you guys heard of that. There is a transgender man who is a father now, and he was invited to be to run a campaign of a cosmetics brand for Father's Day, and this was like huge. Like everybody was against it, like churches and government. So it's not, although there's a lot of people open-minded and with values that respect, there's still a lot of people who are not. So we can't generalize, but there's still room for improvement in that part?
I feel like it's a common trend in actually like all Latin countries, just like the colorism. I think what's unique to Brazil is, I mean, I'm not actually sure if it's unique to Brazil, but what I do know about Brazil is they tend to view themselves as colorblind. Like racism doesn't exist because they didn't have explicit laws like other countries did during like the whole civil rights era and that movement, like the 60s, apartheid in South Africa, what we had here, Jim Crow laws. They didn't have those explicit laws, yet they still had various other ways that racism was systemic. So I think a lot of Brazilians tend to ignore the issue about race and see themselves as like, oh, our country doesn't have racism. Like we don't experience that. But it is true, because the favela, if you look at the favelas and the perception of what is a dangerous neighborhood, most Brazilian people think of a Black Brazilian, and they think Afro-Brazilian, and they associate darker skin color with danger, with the favela, with crime and poverty and violence. It's even like in the movies too, like in Cidade de Deus, like you can see most of them are Afro-Brazilian actually. But you know, it's just one of those things that the statistics show that a lot of homicides it's mostly happening with Afro-Brazilians, and a lot of violence comes from systemic racism and poverty, as we, you know, as I think that we all know. So that all those statistics show us that racism does exist, but because they didn't have those laws of segregation that we had in the US and South Africa, they tend to think that, oh, Americans are so obsessed with race, and other places they're so obsessed with race. We don't have that problem. We're so mixed here. But actually in the history, and I made like a whole graphic about this on my Instagram, I could share with you guys. I did like some research and from various articles, scholarly articles that talked about Afro-Brazilians. Back with colonialism, when the Portuguese settlers were coming, men outnumbered women tremendously so. So that's why a lot of people are mixed, is because there was so many men colonists, and not enough women, and then they would tend to have sex with slaves and indigenous, and they didn't go to say if they were abused or not, if it was consensual, but you know, I can imagine at those times it wasn't always the best conditions for the woman and the most respectful conditions for the woman. But that's one of the big reasons why people are so mixed with indigenous and Black African ancestry, and it's not necessarily because they're so progressive like people like to think. So there's a lot of ignoring the issues in Brazil. Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up really great points, especially about the colorblind Brazilian, like that vibe, and like, let me know if I'm wrong, but I grew up kind of understanding race as more like an individual's tone than their like family background. So like, I don't remember all of the different categories, but there's like pardo, there's like this or that. Let me know if I say something absolutely shitty, because it's been so long since I've been to Brazil. Like a slur. No, I get it.
Well, good.
But it's more, I remember like understanding that it was more about how your skin tone appeared. And I listened to a really good talk about I want to say it was about the policies that were trying to get more like Afro-Brazilians in government jobs. And you having to like prove to them, like you have to do an interview in front of probably mostly white Brazilians, let's be real, proving that you're like Black enough and how complicated that was, and like, what does that even mean, and how can we be the arbiters of race and ethnicity and culture? Is yeah.
Right. Yeah. Wow, that's crazy. Very much true. I still have a lot of friends and family in Brazil, and they talk a lot about like, and there's actually research that backs that up too. That I found out that in their version of like of the census, or their own census about race, people put what they identify as, and what they identify as what their skin color looks like. And a lot of times, even if they are like darker to what an Anglo Saxon person would think, because they're comparing themselves to darker skinned Brazilians, and because they might not want to identify as being negro or mulatto or parda, they might put the more white race on the set on their as they identify on their documentation, because they don't, it's kind of like that negative stereotype again, and they themselves will be like, oh, I don't want to put that because that makes me darker skin, and like, I'm not darker skin, I'm more white, so it's like, it's very hard to get a true data about the ancestry of the people in Brazil too, because people just go by that, their skin, like, oh, well, my skin tone's this, but their parents are black, they'll be like, well, I'm not black.
Now we're gonna actually more go in depth with queerness in Brazil.
What's very interesting about Brazil is it can be a very contradictory country, especially with queerness, because it has a very big queer community and a huge LGBTQ community. Actually, most of my friends that live in Brazil are part of that community. And so when I go there and I visit them, I'm always hanging out with people in that community, going to bars and clubs that are like labeled as LGBTQ, and I'm around people that are very accepting of it. So it's like, I'm only seeing that side, but I know that it's not, because my friends have told me their stories, especially friends from in the interior, which is like El Campo in Spanish, like the more rural areas. And even in the cities too, it's just, we tend to think, oh, like in the cities more progressive, but this problem exists everywhere. Catholicism is so deeply rooted in Brazil, and especially not even just Catholicism, but in the evangelical religion branch of Christianity, is very anti-gay, and they're very against abortion. Like, abortion was illegal in Brazil for the longest time. Well, that's not about queerness. Like, I'm just thinking about religion and politics. Yet, gay marriage was legal in Brazil way before it was here. So Brazil is so contradictory with religion, and I know that affects the queer community greatly. Mm-hmm. That was where I was getting at. But my friend who's gay and lives in Goiânia, he lives in the city, but, experiences the same type of thing, with religion getting in the way of his the relationship with his family. Like, his mom had tried to send him to a therapist, a therapist, but really like someone very religious that thought they could heal him so he could be straight. So, it's a very religious country, and a lot of those religious views do contrast the acceptance for the queer community, yet they have such a big community at the same time. And that's really what I've seen through my experiences.
Thank you. And August?
Yeah, I'm non-binary myself and a member of the queer community, and it's very interesting hearing from my Brazilian queer friends what their experiences are like. I was not out as a teen, so I don't know experientially what that's like. But I grew up in more the evangelical side of Brazil than the Catholic, which is very intense. And in my experiences, very harmful. Right now, they kind of have a chokehold on Brazil, I want to say, like Bolsonaro, like all of that, like a lot of that has been pushed very hard by evangelical Brazilians. This idea of like Brazil is turning over to this, like, I this word is so gross, but like wanton, like this idea of like Brazil, like they hate Carnival. They hate like that Brazil is known for these big parties and known for being very sexually open and whatever, and all of that. I do want to say though, like it's interesting how sometimes it feels like Brazil, like I mentioned before, maybe has a little bit of an identity crisis in that like we want to be known as like the fun country, the country where you can go and have a blast. There's economic reasons for that because we want people to visit. We want tourists to come. That's a huge industry, right? So I think tourism has really affected how some of the freedoms that LGBTQ people do have, because the LGBTQ community has money, and they travel. We especially like you see that more with like white gay men, for example, white gay cis men. But it's an interesting back and forth. I don't want to like say, I don't want to be dismissive at all. I think a lot of the vibrancy in Brazilian culture, for example, comes out of the LGBTQ community, and that's really special and really fun. And it's a paradox in a lot of ways, I think.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you both said, Rachel and Augustine. It's everything is true. And yes, I grew up in a Catholic culture, so and yeah, very very complicated for people to come out. I do have friends in the queer community, and each of them have a different experience. Each of them lived in a different time. So yes, and I would say I don't want to be I don't want to put like warm towels over this, but there are people who are completely, it depends on where that's happening. I think there are places that people are very well welcomed and respected, and there are places that this is completely disrespected and intolerated. So I would say there are places and places. So it's hard. It's still hard for people here in Brazil to be queer, I would say.
Thank you all. And so for the next question, what are your favorite food, music, and shows?
You know, I watch more movies. I was a film student for a little bit. I like a lot of the more classic stuff, like Central do Brasil is one of my favorite films. Yeah, I don't watch a whole lot of shows, so sorry, I'm kind of dry on that question.
Music and food?
Oh, music. Oh, I didn't hear that. Yeah. Food-wise, I grew up eating a lot of like Goiás food, you know, like a lot of the like pretty hearty and comfort food. So like pão de queijo, like pamonha, stuff like that. It's so good. I miss it.
I think the soap operas it's something big here in Brazil. I do not follow them anymore, but when I was little, I used to follow them, and it was something popular here. The movies, I would say that the favorite is Alto da Compadecida. Have you seen it? O Alto da Compadecida. It's pretty nice. I like samba. I would say my favorite Brazilian music, and with food, I'll go with rice and beans.
Nice. Cool. And Raquel?
So, wait, what was the first one? I'm sorry.
Foods, music, and shows or movies.
Okay. So when I grew up, my grandma moved from Brazil when I was about 5 or 6 to live with us, and she would always make feijoada and farofa, and she would always make the brigadeiro, pão de queijo, coxinha. She didn't make coxinha, but when I would go there, like street food, comfort food, coxinha is so good. Guaraná was always my favorite. Like when I went there, I would drink that by the liter. I actually, for TV shows, I really like 3%. It's a Netflix original from Brazil. It's one of the newer ones. It's really good, actually. The latest season kind of like didn't hold up to that hype as the first two, but I watched all the episodes. It's really good. Movies, I watched Centro do Brasil. I watched so much. I watched Clarice, about Clarice Lispector. I watched, of course, Cidade de Deus. Like, Cidade de Deus, like, I know everybody, that's a classic. But for some reason, that movie, like, I will always remember that movie because it's just, I don't know, it's done so well. I had to actually, one of my classes, like, I'm getting my master's in Spanish, but we had to watch that movie because we talked about all Latin America. And I wrote my paper on it because it's just one of those movies that I just feel like everybody should watch. And music, I really like the stuff from the 70s and 80s, like Tropicalia. I love Caetano Veloso. I love Jorge Benjor, Novos Baianos. I like Os Mutantes. I like kind of like the alternative 70s type of Brazilian music. But for newer stuff, I like Seu. I like Anitta, even though she is pop. I find it hard to find new Brazilian music that I like, except Isa. I think you said her name. It's like Iza. I don't know if anyone has heard of her, but she's an Afro. Yeah, she's pretty cool. I like her. Yep. And Carol Conká too. She's Afro-Brazilian. She's really cool too for like more party type music. She's really cool.
Yeah, she's from Curitiba.
Oh, she is. I didn't know that. Que legal.
How do you foresee bridges of solidarity being created amongst the two populations? That is the Latinos in the United States and Brazilians in the United States, as well as the Brazilians in Brazil and across Latin America. Where do you see these solidarity lines connecting?
I don't know. It's kind of hard because a lot of Brazilian people won't identify as Latinx or Latine because they speak Portuguese, even though it's part of the Iberian Peninsula, like Portugal, and the language is so similar. Like, I consider myself Latina, but so many people there will not. So it's really hard to kind of see what that future is, because right now in the present, we have so like this huge disparity of identification, and like what I don't want to say your name wrong. Augustine, thank you, was saying that Brazil does have an identity crisis. I think that's kind of true, with even ethnicity, not just like their color of skin, but also like, are we Latin? Are we Latinos? Are we Latinas? So, and it's not getting better Bolsonaro, because there's a lot of that xenophobia with like Venezuelan migrants, migrants, and he definitely doesn't help. So I think that we gotta get him out of there. So I think if we want solidarity, I don't know.
I feel a little bit more optimistic. I think I really want to hope that and feel like it's going to be better, and we should, right? And I think it's not about I wouldn't say, of course, the government has its implications, but I would say that the population, the people, the Brazilian people, I think they are being more open to different cultures and especially to our neighbors, right? So I want to have high hopes on that. And I hope I'm right. I hope I don't sound too optimistic.
Yeah, I absolutely see, like, I think both of you have like very thoughtful ways of speaking about that, and I appreciate hearing you both. I have to say, I'm so excited by the youth, like the global youth. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just, it's easy to be very doom and gloom about like, oh, young people these days, they don't know that. Like, no, there's just a lot more like self-educating that I see going on, kids seeking out knowledge and like wanting to understand each other and wanting to like be strong communities. That is where I have hope. Like when I look and see like even like my young cousins and like, it's so cool. It's so exciting. I see Brazilians on Twitter all the time, like young kids, and sometimes like, whoa, like you're like 15, and that's crazy. That I had no idea of like what systematic racism was when I was that age, and we see like kids making these accounts and educating each other. That's what really excites me is when kids are like bringing each other and instead of like pushing people away using like policing language and using like, oh, like, you know, you like talked about this wrong or you spoke about this wrong, like bringing people in, right? And I think one of the main tactics that we see colonizing countries use is dividing and conquer. If you can divide people up into like little groups and make them think they're fighting each other, makes your job a whole lot easier. So I think I'm all for Brazilians embracing Latinidad, having a, you know, our nuanced space there, and not saying like, oh, like let's abandon our language or something like that, but like let's carve out a, like we have been welcomed in, let's join in as we're able and unite forces, because I just can't see a better way forward than creating strong, nuanced community bonds. That's what I would say is, and I see that happening, and it's, I'm just so impressed with the youth. It's very exciting.
With that said, that is all the time that we have. Thank you everyone for joining us. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on all our social media outlets and podcast platforms at Latin_entertainment. And our website where we center the Latin American diaspora on Abya at www.latinentertainment.org. Tune in next week for another episode of Conversamos.
Yeah, yo, is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. Music's helping me transform. I run the reservoir, the predator.